Thank you, everyone, for being here with me today electronically. I'm presenting part of my dissertation project called Overpressure, Grassroots-Driven Transformation in Militant Organizations. And as a brief overview, I'll first introduce the general theory of the project, and then look at some general applications, and then go into the extended case study that I have in the paper that I circulated. So the motivating puzzle that I'm working with is, when does ensuring survival in the short run undermine long-term goals for an organization? And the theory that I'm proposing is what I'm calling bottom-up transformation. And so my claim is that when resource-constrained organizations grow quickly, or often have some sort of short-term survival threat, their leaders face this choice of balancing short-term survival with long-term mission focus. And if the leader has an opportunity to do something that will ensure that the organization survives right now, or for the next couple of cycles, whatever the time horizon, they may well know what long-term organizational best practices are, but be tempted to forego them. Ability encourages leaders to end up in a situation in which they have to adjust their goals to accommodate whatever it is that they've had to do to survive in the short term. In this case, it's a personnel-driven thing. So you grow quickly by bringing in people that have important skills or resources that are close enough that you can reach out to them quickly, and that are sort of relatively receptive to what you're interested in doing, but don't quite exactly match onto the organization's goals. But then once you bring the people in, if you bring enough of them in fast enough, you no longer really have the socialization bandwidth to completely bring them into your fold. And so now there's this strong internal pressure on the leadership to start adjusting the strategies and goals to accommodate the new grassroots, even if that wasn't really where the leader wanted to go initially. And so essentially, this is a sort of grassroots-driven mission drift, with the result that you can end up in an extreme case with a leader who's at the top of an organization looking down and saying, well, I've succeeded insofar as my organization is strong and we're going to survive and we're no longer in an acute survival threat, but this isn't really what I wanted to be doing. And I claim that this is particularly acute for organizations that exist with some kind of survival threat that makes them, very willing to pass off these long-term best practices to exist right now. And so this theory, which I've presented intentionally in a very general context and general framework, has a couple of core assumptions built in. The first is that there's an assumption of labor mobility. So the reason that you would accommodate the preferences of your grassroots is that you expect that they can leave. And so you want to keep them. And so you try to make them happier. And similarly, there's some sort of situation in which you have to or want to restrict the inflow of people. So best practices are that you bring in people only so fast as you can socialize them. And here I'm looking at something that sort of overwhelms that buffer. That there's obviously some difference in the priorities of the leadership and the new base. And I think that it's very possible that leaders can foresee what will happen, but they either discount the effect of this. They think that they can socialize the people once they're here, or they think that in the next couple of in the future they'll be able to overcome this challenge, or they just say that they'll deal with it when it comes. So again, sort of speaking generally, what does this project bring that's new? Across several different fields, including political science and management, interestingly, there's a tendency in organizational literature to focus on leaders and the institutions that they create. We think about leaders and we think about them creating internal systems in order to align the grassroots with the leader's goals, or creating internal policies that penalize deviation from this. There's a separate literature looking at mission drift, particularly in terms of nonprofits. And that tends to focus on following monetary influxes rather than resources and recruitment. In the conflict setting, there's literature on external sponsorship, which is very similar, of the cost of having resources coming in from someone who doesn't necessarily share the same goals as you do. And that's very analogous here. However, when you look at case literature, applications tend to assume bottom-up changes, implicitly or explicitly. There's this concept of inclusive decision-making. There's a literature in conflict on the downstream effects of recruitment. So, very famously with Weinstein, if you bring in people that are motivated by ideology or resource-driven greed motivations, then you end up with very different downstream consequences. And that's this kind of grassroots process moving its way up through the organization. So at a high level, what does this look like? There's a story that this is one thing that happened with the Republican Party in the US, is that they needed to harness grassroots energy in about 2008. And so they decided to bring in the Tea Party. And they very intentionally said that when people get elected with these sort of populist right-wing energy, will socialize their representatives in. And as a consequence, last summer you have Governor Kasich of Ohio saying that he didn't leave the Republican Party left me. And there's this sort of relatively public fallout about the consequences of these sort of grassroots insurgency not being very well socialized in. There's a similar story with the transformation of the BJP in India. And more salient to this group, you have the sort of story about the extremist takeover of the FSA in Syria, which is this kind of pincer movement where there's money from the Gulf coming in that enablizes and energizes a more extremist faction, but that you also have a sort of a lot of narrative about local entrepreneurs who figure out that what you can do is you can reach Gulf money online, and you find sort of individual sponsors that then let you go recruit at a mosque and recruit sort of a cadre of very extreme followers that you then go to a brigade and say, well, you would like money, you need resources, bring us in. We have all of this funding. And then they sort of start increasingly pressuring the brigade towards to pick up more and more extremist policies. So the motivating extended case that I presented in the paper is Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, where there is, sorry? Oh, sorry, I thought I heard someone breaking in. Where there's this very strong narrative that AQAP becomes stronger because of the war on terror, and that's allowed them to access a large number of Sunni tribal recruits. But it's also a really nice case because there's a lot of evidence of strategic advice from Al-Qaeda to AQAP to avoid involvement in local insurgencies. So we should know what they want to be doing. But there's simultaneously an evidence of a long-standing desire to embed in Sunni communities, which gives a motivation for reaching out and bringing in the local Sunni communities when they're possibly able to be accessed. There are other conflict actors to serve as reference points. Government weakness means that more or less what AQAP is doing is what AQAP wants or has to be doing, or sort of it is driven by internal challenges rather than driven by external relationship with the government. And nicely for me, they created an organization that was intended to be the local spinoff, Ansar al-Sharia. So the counterfactual, without this upwards driving pressure from local Sunni tribal members coming in and starting to tilt the organization towards being increasingly focused on Sunni tribal issues in Yemen versus a transnational jihadi ideology, you should see AQAP focusing on big picture conflicts, retaining their sense of being a transnational jihadi vanguard based in Yemen, and then working through their local spinoff if they need to be involved in local conflict. So you should expect to see Ansar al-Sharia being more involved in the local politics of insurgency, whereas AQAP is more sort of regionally focused. But however, the theory expects that you should see AQAP and Ansar al-Sharia really converging. You should see Sunni tribal members keeping AQAP locally grounded, because whenever AQAP tries to sort of move towards this global jihadi transnational insurgency that they primarily are aiming at, the community members that are recruited by AQAP saying, we represent you, we're here for the Sunni community, should push their preferences to stay more engaged with local civil war and local conflict dynamics. And so you should see this convergence between AQAP and their intended local spinoff. And this should become stronger as the local community becomes more involved in the organization. And AQAP is increasingly known for being a local conflict actor. So this should be a self-perpetuating process. Now, the problem is that studying Yemen and the conflict dynamics of Yemen is an extremely information-poor setting. So what I do for the empirical strategy is I try to look at where we might see evidence of this theory from several different angles, and particularly things that you can see externally if the theory's predictions are correct. And so one of the things that I do is look at news stories, which help anchor how the perception of local actors changes over time. And so this is an indirect measure of what's going on. It's what sort of locally expert journalists are reporting. And then I look at what AQAP itself is talking about, what AQAP is doing, to see if did this one just break in? Oh no, okay, sorry, I'm getting a little bit of echo. And so what you want to see is whether or not AQAP increasingly talks about itself as being a local conflict actor driven by local concerns or a transnational actor. So for the first strategy of what are our local external viewers seeing, and how are they deciding sort of to attribute the activities of different conflict actors, I pulled news stories about Yemen conflict events in Yemen from IQs from 2009 to 2015, which more or less spans the time period that we should expect this to happen. And then I randomly sampled slightly more than 15% of them, and code the 566 stories that either talk about AQAP, Ansar al-Sharia, or Houthi violence, in which those were identified as the actors doing various different types of violence, and divided into a training test split. So what do these news stories look like, and why am I looking at them as a source of sort of relatively fine-grained conflict data? They might look like this example, which is Al-Qaeda militants saying who they targeted, where they were acting, what kind of weapons they were using. And now this ends up being transferred into a bag of words. So it's not an extremely granular bit of data, but you should have embedded in here targets, tactics, agent. And so then what I do is say that what we should see is a clear separation among the activities of these actors. If the separation of sort of zones of influence is what we see, and we should see a convergence of AQAP and Ansar al-Sharia if not. And again, I'm looking sort of indirectly, so I'm taking three approaches: a random forest, an SVM, support vector machine, and a TS&E visualization. So basic plausibility is that you should see separation of the Sunni groups from the Houthi insurgency. And then with bottom-up transformation, you should see AQAP activities distinct from Ansar or without bottom-up transformation, you should see distinct AQAP versus Ansar al-Sharia. And with bottom-up transformation, we expect to see a more difficult time separating AQAP from Ansar al-Sharia. So this is one example of just visualization of the differences between this news stories for the three different organizations. And so sort of on the y-axis, you have separation that's essentially some stories are longer than others, and that's where you get this horseshoe effect. But you do see a very clear separation between stories that write about the Houthis, which are in blue here, and stories that are both Ansar al-Sharia and AQAP, but not much internal separation between stories about Ansar al-Sharia and AQAP, which is telling us that over this 8-year time period, Ansar al-Sharia and AQAP are tending to be written about in very similar ways, which may indicate that they're acting in very similar ways. The problem is that it may also indicate that they're being written about in similar ways, but acting very differently.
About 2 more minutes.
Okay, great. And so what I want to do is look at how AQAP is talking about itself in order to help differentiate the difference between being written about similarly or actually being similar. So I look at a cache of 897 AQAP statements released online from 2004 to 2016, which includes both AQAP and Ansar al-Sharia that are separately tagged, and compare against documents released by Al-Qaeda central leadership to see if one thing that might be happening is that AQAP is becoming more locally focused, but so is everyone else at the same time. And these are translated into English for various reasons that I detail some of them in the paper. But they're very consistently translated, which is helpful. So what should we see? We should see AQAP moving towards Ansar al-Sharia, which is this local shift. Or we could see a general localizing shift across the AQAP and Ansar al-Sharia and As-Sahab corpus. But what ideally you should see is localizing shift. And indeed, what I find is that in the communiques, there's this increasing tendency for AQAP communiques to focus on local targets, even if you separate out those communiques from the Ansar al-Sharia ones. And so, what this uptick at the end of the time period across the x-axis indicates is that local targets and discussions about the Houthi insurgency start really dominating the topic model after about 2014. And then you also, across the same time period, you see this divergence between AQAP and Al-Qaeda's central messaging. So it's not that everyone is converging on local issues versus transnational issues. Is that actually As-Sahab is increasingly focusing on transnational issues, while AQAP is increasingly not picking up issues that are things like Palestine and Somalia and Gaza and defending Muslim women and children, which are very general transnational jihadi concerns. And so from there, I sort of can conclude that in this indirect way of looking at what may be going on internally from how organizations are presenting themselves, there's evidence of the localizing transformation that you would expect if a large influx of Sunni tribal actors is increasingly pressuring AQAP to act in order, as a Sunni tribal actor in Yemen, rather than a transnational jihadi vanguard, which is how they intended, according to released strategy documents. And so substantively, this is presenting a theory of bottom-up transformation. Methodologically, I'm looking at sort of backing out feature-rich data in an information-poor context and combining complementary text as data approaches and sort of machine learning approaches to triangulate difficult information in support of the theory. And thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Margaret. Well done. I'm Emily Hencken Ritter. I'm an associate professor at Vanderbilt University, and I'm running the online Peace Science Colloquium. Today, discussing Margaret Foster's paper is we're joined by Amelia Hoover-Green, who's an assistant professor, hopefully soon to be associate at Drexel University. We have Peter Schram, who's an assistant professor at Vanderbilt University, and we have Theo McLauchlin, who is an associate professor at the University of Montreal. Welcome all, and now we can open up for comments, questions on her paper, for whoever would like to start. Okay, Amelia.
Unmute your mic, Amelia.
Yeah, hang on, you're muted.
Yeah. Here I am. Is that better?
Yeah, good.
Okay, cool. Margaret, first of all, thank you. That was it was super fascinating to read. It's been a minute since I did any machine learning myself. So I was like, all right, random forest and
right.
And so I which is kind of a motivator for the comment that I kind of wanted to put on the table first, which is I think you answered this question in your presentation, but basically, as I was reading the paper, I wanted a stronger decision about whether this is a paper whose big contribution is a test of an empirical implication of the theory, or whether it's a paper whose kind of primary contribution is like a working example of what you've called, quote, a tool to assess the consequences of changes in organization circumstances. So, empirical or methodological, I think you're trying to do both, and then I'm not sure there's enough room in a paper to do both of those.
Okay.
I would tend toward the first. I think that trying to assess empirically the theory is maybe the right way to go, but that's just me.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's
my comment.
Okay. Do you want to respond at all?
I was going to briefly say that it's well taken. I think that's really good advice. That there's a lot going on in this paper, even with too many appendices. It's still a lot going on in this paper. So.
Peter.
Sure. So first of all, Margaret, thank you for this paper. I thought it was super thought-provoking. I guess I looked at this paper largely through the sort of contribution of the organizational theory or organizational economics literature. I think the story that you have, I think the standard organizational economic story is as organizations grow, you have to hire these people who aren't aligned, and then you have all of these sorts of agency problems. And I think in the paper, which I would strongly encourage everyone listening to this to read, in the paper, your first model is very consistent with this idea that AQAP's behavior converged over time towards the behavior in Ansar al-Shia, a group that was mostly mission focused. And I think that speaks to agency problems. But then the second and third model are what's really cool, because in the standard principal agent models, you have these fixed principal preferences. And what you're presenting is this great suggestive evidence that there's something different going on. And that as more of these local agents are coming in, the leadership became less like Al-Qaeda Central and more like Ansar al-Sharia, this local focused group. I mean, I could keep rambling about why I think this is so great and why I think this speaks to a lot of different groups that start off ideologically and then, you know, like the FARC that started ideologically as Marxist-Leninists, then ended up as cocaine traffickers. But you know, you get that. You wrote this paper. I guess the one thing that I would like to focus on, and then I'd want to piggyback on some of the machine learning type issues raised. First, I think the theory is really compelling, but I feel like you're maybe not filling out one step as much as I would like. So the way that I view your theory is step one, a militant group needs to grow. Step two, the leadership is recruiting people whose preferences aren't fully aligned. Step three is a little ambiguous to me. And then step four, the leadership becomes more aligned. I'd love to know more about what's going on with step three. Is it the old guard being killed off? Is it the old guard making friends with the new recruits? Is the new guard so desperate for recruits that it starts pitching things differently? I think the more that you could do with that step, this step of actual preference alignment between agents and principal, just by nature of the agents being there, that's something that I think is pretty novel and something that I'd like to know more about.
Can I add directly to that?
Sure, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, this is a thing that I noticed. There's this like really tantalizing line in the abstract that says, where did it go in my notes? Oh, it says, quote, if leaders are unable to quickly socialize their recruits, etc., then this sort of theoretical then my theory kind of falls out of that, right? And so I want to strongly agree with what Peter is saying, and also maybe even add to that, just that it's not clear to me whether what's going on here is non-socialization or failed socialization, and why. And so I think drawing more on the armed group socialization literature to talk about sort of recruitment, vetting, discipline, indoctrination, training as things that either, right? Because if it's as things that might affect this process, because if it's failed socialization, then that's great for your story, because that's evidence that leaders really, really care about this internationalist agenda. They just, you know, for whatever reason, whether it's a mismatch between short-term goals and the sort of longer-term vetting socialization stuff, they just failed. If it's non-socialization, right, if they're just not bothering in this particular case for any kind of a reason, then we have to make a case, a kind of harder case, because it raises the possibility that the leadership had their own reasons for not caring so much any longer about internationalist goals. So I just wanted to agree, essentially.
We have two fingers. So Theo and then Peter again.
Yeah, about this, and I think for me, reading it more from a conflict point of view, it made a pretty clear contribution. I thought it was interesting that Peter was reading it from the other point of view, from more organizational economics. And for me, there's a bit of a question about how you want to pitch it, like where the central contribution is. If you wanted to study organizations and organizations generally, and talk about the implications that this would have for precisely something like the BJP or the Republican Party or other organizations that you mentioned in the talk, there's plenty easier organizations to study, right, than the one that you've chosen to do. And one of the big contributions that you make in the paper, which I think is terrific, is just the methodological innovations for precisely getting at an opaque organization, in particular in a conflict setting. And the way that you're able to do that in the paper is one of the paper's coolest things that you do. And so I think Peter is quite right to think that step 3 that he laid out is a super fascinating question. I think in this context, it would be a bit of a big ask, for you to find out something about what it was that pushed the AQAP's leadership to shift. It would be a question that would be a lot easier to answer in a different context. I think it'd be good to theorize about it and to talk about what the possibilities would be, given what we know about the organization and about other comparable organizations. But I think it'd be, from my point of view, I think it might be a little bit too much to ask the paper to do to include, any analysis of that step beyond, beyond theorizing. I think what you've been able to do with an organization that's hard to find out a lot about is by itself enough, and more than enough for a substantial contribution here.
Peter, you still want to?
Yeah, my two finger on that was very consistent with the point just made. You don't need to do this for AQAP. I would say, right. Look, just find evidence of this happening in other groups, talk about other similar groups, and talk about how the pressures that led to this sort of step 3 that seemed present in other groups was also occurring in AQAP. There was probably some sort of leadership targeting going against AQAP. And so when leadership targeting happens, you need to pull up recruits from the bottom. That's one possible mechanism. Another possible mechanism, we have, just any sort of literature on bringing together diverse people, and that can lead to some sort of cooperation and shared understanding. That's another strain of the literature you can pull from. Obviously, if you can do this for AQAP, that would be amazing. But like you said, this is low information environment. We all know it's a low information environment, and anything you can do on that would be just, I think, appreciated.
Margaret, you want to respond to all of this?
Yeah, so sort of to really focus on this step 3, and then to say, the point about AQP being very difficult is well taken. For me, I think one of the things, so generally, as sort of the bigger picture of this project is that this is sort of the end of the dissertation of assuming that the theory I presented is correct. How would you see it from the outside? So let's take an intentionally super opaque organization, and work from there. But yeah, so to really focus in on step 3. I think that there's a couple of things that happen, and sometimes concurrently. So I think in AQAP, it's one of those cases where there's so much going on that I think you have both targeting and some internal replacement moving up. I think that there is a failure of socialization, in large part because there's such heavy density of drone strikes and of aerial bombardment. So over and over and over, when you read literature and sort of strategy documents and even memoirs from militants, one of the things that comes out very strongly is socialization in camps, in person, and being able to sort of isolate the entire information and basically emotional context of the fighters is extraordinarily important, or at least very effective. And I think, Amelia, you have some work previously on the FARC in different locations and how sort of isolated training camps and recruitment camps or sort of socialization camps can end up going in very different directions depending on sort of a process, a path-dependent process. But increasingly, and Yemen is a really good case of this, what a training camp looks like is a bomb site now. And so now it's very difficult to get people together and monopolize their time and energy and emotions in quite the same way. And so now you have groups that are becoming increasingly diffuse, which means that it's really more difficult to break existing internal networks and kin networks and social networks that they bring in with them to the organization. And so you simultaneously have a more difficult socializing environment and a more difficult socialization case at the same time, which then kind of like amplifies this introduction and lack of overriding or socializing out the existing preferences and replace them with the leaders' or initial preferences, which is an interesting context. And I think that is probably increasingly one that we'll see more as in the conflict setting as time goes on, and as maybe Yemen dynamics, maybe not as extreme, but as they sort of are replicated elsewhere. In terms of, but then, for me, one of the things that I find to be, what I'm really trying to get with the dissertation and grappling with now is what is step 3? Like, what is going on in the leader's mind during step 3? Do they say, my gut feeling is that what happens is they know where they want to be going, but they can't get there. And they know that if they push too hard, then they'll lose these recruits that are, for various reasons, important enough to bring in too fast to socialize. And then there's this a very acute feeling of leverage that the base has, which then becomes maybe articulated internally as such of like, I have to compromise. I can only push so far. And then that's what starts creating, that encourages the leader to limit for themselves how much, like what it is that they ask their rank and file to do, which then changes how the organization behaves, which then changes who is recruited into the organization, which then changes, who is being trained and who moves upwards through the organization. And then as leaders get replaced and you have incompletely socialized, former rank and file members that are moving their way up, then you have this increasing retrenchment of the new goals as opposed to the leader's initial goals. And I think that a lot of that comes down to the sense of being restricted on what you can ask your people to do. And I'm trying to find out how that happens. What I've been finding in different contexts is when you ask people this, they say, "Oh, no. We never feel constrained." But it's important to tell them, to use the words that they want to hear, or it's important to show that you're listening, or show that you're, keeping in mind what it is that your new members want. And so, yeah. So the point's well taken. If you have suggestions for other ways to get at this key step 3, I'd be very happy to hear them.
Peter, really quickly, and then Theo.
Those anecdotes were great. That's a good way to get at it.
Silently.
Oh, sure.
Big fan. Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. Theo.
I agree. Right. But I think that the one of the issues that you've got in the paper, and you try to tackle it head on, is that the other explanation for the shift in what the leadership of AQAP is doing, and the incentives they're responding to, comes more from the top, and with the change in direction from Al Qaeda Central with Zawahiri's accession. And so it's definitely you're 100% right to identify as the key alternative explanation. And I think that there's a couple of ways in the paper that you might think about improving your discussion of this issue. In particular, something it's a little bit concerning to me is that ultimately it rests a lot on the idea that the propaganda that Al Qaeda Central is putting out is different in important ways from the propaganda that AQAP is putting out in terms of the themes that it highlights. And I can see why you'd think that this would be a clear instance of leadership of differences in preferences between AQC and AQAP. But the alternative reading of that is that this actually fits rather well if Zawahiri's strategy is to downplay links between Al Qaeda Central and local Al Qaeda affiliates. But what they would want to do is to hide that by, for example, talking about different things in their own rhetoric versus in the rhetoric that AQAP is putting out. So it's pretty hard to get at, and I don't know that there's necessarily a super clear way of addressing that possibility. I'm not. This isn't a conflict that I'm especially well familiar with. I'm a little bit more familiar with Syria, where it seems that the idea of hiding the links between, or attempting to hide the links at any rate between Jabhat al-Nusra and Al Qaeda Central was precisely the strategy that they pursued for a while until it was, manifestly unsustainable to do that. So, given that it's called AQAP, Al Qaeda, the link was there already, well before Zawahiri took over. That's impossible, But it's still the notion that they might want to differentiate at any rate the rhetoric of AQAP from that of Al Qaeda Central may account for the phenomenon that
right. Although I wonder if then what happens after the links between Jabhat al-Nusra and Al Qaeda Central are revealed and acknowledged is actually really useful here. Then to say that one thing that you do see in this context, basically Syria and Egypt, for obvious reasons because of the Zawahiri connection, are repeatedly, Al Qaeda Central is heavily involved rhetorically in those conflicts. And so then there's this evidence that, this is suggestive that Al-Qaeda Central is still being very involved where they think that there's need or there's responsiveness to their message.
And are they less involved here? Oh, sorry, just to clarify to return to circle around back to Yemen and the distinction with those other Syria or Egypt. Is a similar thing happening here in Yemen, or is it not?
I would want to go back and refresh myself on the numbers, but my sense is that Yemen just completely drops out of the Al-Qaeda Central rhetoric, in large part because it's crowded out, right? So you have the Arab Spring, and then you have the sort of stop and start political revolution in Egypt, and then you have the Nusra ISIS fallout in Syria, and so then for about a year or two, a lot of the rhetoric becomes, particularly from Al-Qaeda Central, becomes very heavily focused on adjudicating the Syrian conflict. And then there's a lot of messaging from AQAP and Akim and Al-Qaeda Central to sort of essentially use the status of elder statesmen of these leaders in regional Al-Qaeda affiliates to encourage moderation and encourage unification of the jihadi effort in Syria. And so my sense is that Yemen is just very much not on the table as much anymore. And then I think I would claim in the context of this paper, and that's partially as Yemen just becomes very much internally focused, as the jihadi conflict there is much more about the Yemeni civil war.
Peter, I'm sorry, Amelia.
Unmute. There I go. Yeah, so I think I might, and I'm not sure it's for any good reason, disagree with Theo about what is the key alternative explanation here, or at least about what is the sort of population of alternative explanations. I agree that there's an alternative explanation involving kind of overall changes in the tactics at Central. Another alternative explanation that I'm having a hard time doing away with is basically some other non-bottom-up dynamic within AQAP. And that's, I have, my notes here are so nice. I'm like, I have all these exclamation points and hearts and stars because I'm so pleased reading this paper about just the kind of clarity and transparency about just how hard of an information environment this is. And it's still a hard information environment. So I think, I think my standards might be possibly a little bit bonkers, oh, I actually want to know about the socialization processes failed or non-existent or whatever, but also just to think a little bit more, to think seriously about other things that could be causing the what we observe as a sort of AQAP, AAS amalgamation in both news stories and public documents, right? So when I was thinking about this, I was thinking, okay, so misclassification of AAS, right? That could be because AQAP is doing things that make it look more like AAS, right? That's the central idea. Or it could be because, right, of bias in news sources, that already, or it could be because of not exactly a bias in what events are covered, but because it's known that AQAP and AAS are effectively the same organization, and that affects the coverage. Or it could be, right, that for whatever reason, AQAP is directing the change. And when I think about sort of machine learning issues, I think about unbalanced data. When I look here, it's been a minute, like I said, and I'm wondering, in the case of the classification exercise, what does it mean that AAS stories are only 6% of the sample? So my my experience has been that is a good way to cause sort of false negative misclassifications. So I think I'm annoyed with myself because I don't think this is, I'm not sure this is leading to a constructive comment about your presentation or about the paper. But I think trying to find ways into the sort of broad set of alternative explanations that we might see, and trying to make the case that that no, this is not a plausible explanation for what we see in the data. Just to really, like, if it's going to be an empirical proof of a theoretical idea, then I would want that to be, like, you know, really pinned down. And you know, and I'm going to send you notes, and they've got a whole bunch of rambling about this. But that's like the central problem for me, is sort of, yeah, the data are not, like, it's, the information environment is bad. The data therefore can't quite match the theory. And you've done an amazing job of trying to get there, but I'm not sure the paper as it stands, like, fully convinced me.
Margaret.
Yeah, so the imbalance is a problem, right? And so one of the things that I'm sure you noticed is that when everything is misclassified for Ansar al-Sharia, that's because nothing is being predicted as being Ansar al-Sharia. You know, AQAP is so, like, it so dominates the sort of Shia documents that basically all of the classification tools say that everything is AQAP. And so there's a couple of things that could be going on here. The first is that it's an imbalanced data. And so I do a weighted random forest and find effectively the same results, but weighting doesn't really, weighting kind of counterbalances the underlying problem, but doesn't eliminate it entirely. A little more insidiously, as people know that Ansar al-Sharia and AQAP are the same, the question is, do you end up with a lot of articles that talk about, here's an activity claimed by Ansar al-Sharia, and that's 2 sentences, and then you have a page and a half about the larger conflict context, in which case you'll end up with everything mixed together. And so that's where one of the things I'm trying to do is look from a couple of different angles, look at both short and long documents. I don't think I present these results of just looking at the first couple of sentences in every document, by looking at sort of taking the general best practices in journalism of you front load the actual event and then you put the context towards the end. Looking at as well convergence over time. So as what tends to happen is people increasingly write about the larger conflict context, you start seeing this convergence, especially, do we back that out? One of the things that I found really interesting as I was doing a lot of robustness on the machine learning is that consistently what ends up happening is the Houthi groups are described as being insurgencies, whereas the Al-Qaeda groups and the Sunni groups are described as being terrorists. And so that's one of the things that really drives a lot of the separation, which is fascinating, but sort of orthogonal to the project that I was working on here. And since there's only so far that you can go in kind of reading tea leaves, that's where I was hoping that bringing in some of the strategic advice helps backstop this concern a little bit, by saying that, that conflates a little bit your point about failed socialization versus no socialization, which I'm reading into that of this question of, maybe it's a top-down transformation process. Maybe the goal is to say, it's beneficial for us to become more local. So therefore, we're going to bring people in and not push the transnational agenda too far. We'll intentionally expand our local recruitment. And so that's where we're looking at a lot of these sort of earlier strategic documents chastising AQAP for being too involved in local conflicts, and pulling the jihadi lessons learned as sent to AQAP about the difficulty about how tempting it is to become involved in local community conflicts, but how this is in the long term detrimental to the overarching cause. So insofar as there's a continuation of the strategic goals as presented from Al-Qaeda Central into AQAP, and not just a wholesale walking back from them, you should see at least attempts to not completely devolve into or transfer into a local conflict, because it's so clearly something that's been identified as having been done in the past to the detriment of the cause.
Peter.
Yeah. So this is piggybacking on some of the past two comments that you just got. I'm okay. Am I not muted? Okay. Cool. So I think whenever you're presenting time trend data like this, people in seminars will ask you to consider alternate takes. And I think there's a couple different ways that you could do this to move forward. I think one way to do this would be to, treat this as time series data and show there's not discontinuities like at big relevant events that could be driving your results. For example, it could be when I looked at figure 1, my knee jerk was, I wonder if the Arab Spring had anything to do with these sorts of results. But, doing a time trend like that would, and just showing this isn't where the discontinuity lies, that could be useful. Alternatively, you don't see this as often, but I think a really powerful thing to do, a powerful thing to do is actually treat the data that you're generating via machine learning as data points, and then use that as part of a more traditional statistical analysis. That, of course, given the low information environment that you're working in, that may not be possible, but it might be something to keep your eyes peeled for. And then sort of the last way for handling the possible alternative explanations is you have a section where you think of the top 10 or so alternate takes, and using your knowledge of the case, or reading the tea leaves, as you said, and just talk about why this isn't the case. And I think doing something like that, I think because people acknowledge you're working in information-rich, information-poor environment, and because your theory is interesting, having this sort of section of, look, I am thinking critically about these other issues. These are real issues. I can knock some of these alternate explanations out. Maybe I can't knock all of them out, but still, this is a valuable paper because of X, Y, and Z.
Margaret?
Thank you. Those are excellent suggestions. Thank you. I think, is there? I think if there's anything specific to address.
It's okay if there's not. Just want to give you a chance.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Theo.
So to follow up on that a little bit, I think I think one thing in particular that Peter said there was, I think, good advice. But one element that I thought was particularly interesting was the notion of a discontinuity or a more gradual shift. And I think one thing in particular that I can see in your figures is that some of the shifts, if I'm not mistaken, seem to occur more around 2014, starting in 2013, 2014, 2015, rather than say in 2011. And that's interesting in particular for a couple of the big alternative explanations. So we've talked about the leadership of the Al-Qaeda Central question. The other one would be just the outbreak, as Peter said, of the Arab Spring, in particular of the Yemeni civil war, which is going to considerably change the kinds of targets, right, that the kind of messaging, I would think, that Al-Qaeda Peninsula is going to do. But then I think the notion that the shift would only occur, that some of the rhetorical shifts that you see, for instance, would only occur later on, is pretty interesting because it suggests that it's not responding to these epochal changes that occur in 2011 directly. But what would it be that would take some time to emerge? Thinking a little bit here in Paul Pearson's terms, but the gap between when input, when the cause occurs and the effect occurs. But one of the processes that could take a certain amount of time is precisely what you were saying before about generations of recruits coming up and replacing previous leaders and gaining a role where they can have an influence on the messaging or self-presentation that occurs. So you might want to think about that. That seems to be an element that's jumping out at me as more consistently plausibly linked to your explanation than to the others that we've developed. I'll also, I think in general, say that the theory that you present is strong enough that I'm prepared to buy it very quickly. You know, and compared to some of the evidence. So I think you're in a strong place to begin with.
Thank you. Yeah, 2011 was a big year. Bin Laden dies, al-Awlaki dies, Arab Spring, Yemen Civil War. And as you point out, there's particularly the most dramatic is this the figure with the topics about the Houthi and the rise of local targets. And that's really after 2014. And so what ends up happening sort of in the data there is that starting in 2014, especially into 2015, communiques about targeting Houthis begin to crowd out everything else. And so then it becomes a much more tactically driven communication style, which is interesting. And I think that one of the things that didn't really come as much in the presentation, and it's a little bit in the paper, is that the diffuse nature of running an insurgency in this kind of an environment where it's just very difficult to aggregate people means that I think it's actually quite risky to make big general statements. Unless you're preparing to be on message internationally and domestically. So if you recruit, essentially, this is what the arguments that I used for actually using propaganda documents is that if you recruit people locally using argument 1, and then you say, you use argument 2 internationally, but you don't have a chance to get everyone in the same room and say locally and say, okay, everything we're saying is just for the international audience. And I think that there are very good reasons to expect that there is a fair amount of communication, but there's not a lot of very intensive communication all the time, such that you might find it risky to be playing a bi-level propaganda game. And so I think that helps. That really helps drive also a transition towards more local engagement from the people, but also a more tactical propaganda focus versus like a big sort of general messages.
Amelia.
I think I think Theo's comment sort of got to most of what I was interested in saying just now. I suppose that the thing that I, continuing in my obnoxious vein of trying to really nail things down, not obnoxious. It's a little obnoxious. It's also useful. I'm cool with that. Theo was bringing up timing issues, and there's I think it's worth more space in the article to really say, okay, here's what's happening in the conflict context. Here's what's happening in the data generation processes. Here's what's happening in my theory, we think. Here's what's happening with recruitment, and try and line those things up in sort of as narrow a space as possible.
Okay.
I think that's pretty much all I wanted to say. Just, to take one example, you have, since 2011, online platforms have been a major means of communication, which could suggest, right, this explanation that you kind of raise and then throw out a little bit earlier, that AQAP is sort of doing more local pandering because people in Yemen are more likely to have the internet now, which is potentially tough for your theory. So I think just addressing that stuff as kind of specifically as you can.
I can almost see the figure, sort of a timeline with like things happening.
It's an amazing figure in my brain.
It's like a museum, you first walk into an exhibit, you have the timeline.
It would be so great. It would be really great to to see exactly where you place the influx of new recruits as compared quite specifically to the other sort of temporal issues in conflict data generation, international attention, etc. As well as, frankly, I had a whole list of questions about like, okay, where's all the qualitative information about socialization? And it seems like that's in your brain. And I think that it would really add to this story if more of it were in the paper. Like, it seems like maybe the paper is trying to like really see how far it can go with the data, with this kind of data.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that's hamstrung you a little bit in terms of ruling out alternative explanations.
Okay.
So, say more anecdotes. I guess that's just in agreement with Peter.
I don't know if Margaret, you want to respond to that first before I ask my question?
So the one that is really difficult there is the when do recruits come in? And so that's one of the things that actually, as I write the paper and I work on the paper, update the paper and go see what comes out of Yemen, you can sort of start adding in layers that become increasingly revealed. And so I'll see what I can do to augment that, especially because I mean, that's the important question, right? Like, when do big recruits come in? And you see there's sort of several, you can find several windows and snapshots that bring anecdotes. And the question is, what's the data generating process of, not hypothetically, the New York Review of Books talking about the changing situation of Yemen and profiling motivations of people who are mobilized for anti-Houthi motivations. Well, that's partially when this happens, and partially when there's enough interest to send someone to go do this, and partially when someone's paper, like article, gets through the editorial process. And so, yeah, qualitative. But I think that even if I can't be as precise as maybe everyone would want me to be, including myself, I think it'd be extremely valuable to have that timeline. And for no other reason, it would be very valuable, but also sort of say like, okay, here's where things get fuzzy. Like, let's go fill that in. Here's something that's a little bit, that could be more precisely aligned, or it overlaps in unexpected ways.
So I agree with this idea of front-loading a clarified timeline. It's a really good suggestion from Amelia. As you're doing that, I think it would be a good idea to clarify the directions that are coming from Al-Qaeda Central. Early on in the paper, you talk about the criticisms of AQAP as focusing too much on local conflicts.
Mm-hmm.
And you talk about the shift that occurs with Zawahiri's accession later on in the paper. We get to that, but it's relevant for interpreting the results that you present before it. So I think as you're clarifying the timeline initially, I think it would be a good move to as you're doing that to make it clear from the beginning what the line is coming down from Al-Qaeda Central, in order to enable the reader to properly understand properly put into context the actions that AQAP is engaging in, or is reported to be engaging in anyway, get the IQ's data, as well as the propaganda that's coming out.
As you say this, I'm thinking about how to reorganize appendices versus the text of the paper. Because one of the things, so the paper's already long, and it has been longer in the past. And part of that is a lot of this timeline stuff was in there earlier and came out and needs to go back in quite clearly. And so then probably a lot of the quantitative, a lot of the newspaper stuff maybe in an appendix, with just quickly presenting results, I think. Yeah.
Okay.
And in conclusion, if any of you also have other cases that jump out as you read the paper or we talk through it, I would love to hear them. I'm trying to build a collection of places to go looking for this process occurring, that may be a little bit less opaque, where you can more precisely pick up this step 3.
Yeah.
Quick suggestion on that, precisely related to that. It's Sarah Parkinson's paper in Perspectives on Politics in 2017 called Money Talks. It had my own written comments that I was going to send to you to take a look at, but it's precisely relevant. It talks about multiple generations within Fatah and some conflicts between the two of them in particular, it's relevant to one point that you made quickly about questions about the motivations of different generations. Like, are they in it for the money? Just like that. And so it's so she gets at a lot of this kind of stuff. And I think in a way that I think can inform this step through.
If I can add to that, I think there's trying to think about other positive cases here. The one that really comes to mind, and this is maybe a weird one, or maybe not, I can't quite tell, is cases of rondas campesinas in, say, Peru or Guatemala. So these are cases where, like, this is a pro-government militia that needs, obviously, the government is like, hey, come be a militia on our side. And these organizations get up and running quite fast because they have a lot of central government support. And then they're like, yeah, actually, we just want to be in control of our local area. And those are, that's a useful, I think that's a useful comparison, and there's much better information. So on the case of Guatemala, there's a Gina Bateson article in the JPR 2017 special issue on socialization. And then I'm going to blank on the name of the right article from Peru, but that might be a useful comparison.
Okay. Thank you.
Peter.
Yeah, I'm not. So I think you're going to have a hard time finding cases where you can actually document the leadership's preferences changing towards that of the agents. But kind of two examples that a couple examples I could think of is the Abu group in the Philippines. It started out as a jihadist group. Now it mostly kidnaps and smuggles, and the leadership seems fairly okay with that. The Russian Revolution started as communist, then it got Stalin. Broadly speaking, jihadist groups, jihadist ideology starts with this idea of leaderless jihad and that political entities are sacrilege, but then a few years in they tend to look more like these quasi-states. So to the extent that I think that illustrates leadership's preferences shifting, I think there's lots of great lots of great cases out there.
Yeah, I was thinking also from a previous online peace science colloquium, looking at changes in peace treaties. So now there's a lot of work on what is being asked for in peace negotiations and whether or not that changes and how that responds to basically internal constituents in an organization.
Theo.
One possibility might be the shifts in loyalist militias in Spain during the Civil War, which start to recruit quite widely, going well beyond their initial sort of tightly knit membership based on union political party locals, and sort of have a drastic expansion early on. And there's a certain sort of considerable struggles about just how revolutionary to be under those circumstances, and in particular, but it's complicated by interfactional rivalries as well. So that might wind up being not such a terribly clean story to look at. But,
Great. Well, thank you very much for all of these suggestions. Extremely fruitful.
Awesome. Oh, Peter's talking. Hang on.
Thank you for the paper. It was great.
yes, thank you.
And super thought-provoking. Yeah.
And thank you for your time.
Very welcome.
I know that's not quite a precious commodity, especially as the semester is continuing.
Yeah.
We're almost over if you're at a quarter school.
Almost over. As FRO's ISA papers is becoming, sort of on the horizon.
Yeah.
ISA is tweeting about whether we're done with our papers. It's mean.
Are they really?
I've almost finished starting my paper.
I have merged the data for my paper.
Thank you all. Thank you, Margaret, for presenting your paper today. And I'd like to remind anyone watching that they can rewind back to the beginning and watch our presentation, or you can visit the online Peace Science Colloquium website to find the full paper there. And I highly recommend that you read it. And if you do read it, send Margaret your comments. Her email is on the paper. Thank you to Amelia and to Theo and to Peter for giving your time and reading the paper and giving great comments. This was a really great discussion today. And so with that, thank you all for joining us, and reminder that in 2 weeks we'll have another presentation from Hans-Inge Lango from the University of Texas, and he's presenting on the international competition and the onset of civil war. So hopefully we'll see you again soon. Thank you all.
Thank you.